Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Faxon. I am going to be giving a talk today on turning real life into fiction. So I'm just going to go ahead and make this fill my screen. All right, so as I mentioned, we're going to be talking today about turning real life into fiction, research, showing not telling, and writing responsibly. A little bit about me. I am the president of the San Diego Writers and Editors Guild. I'm the co-founder of No Bad Books Press, and I'm a very proud member of the Semi-Sages of the Pages, a writing podcast. My interests include true crime, criminal psychology, reading, writing, and whiskey. I'm the author of political fantasy books, The Animal Court, and Foreign and Domestic Affairs. These books are both now available. And my upcoming works, Tiny Dreadfuls, which is a collection of horrors, oddities, and tales of the dark, is available for pre-order right now and will be available on April 21st, along with Lost Aboard, which is a creative nonfiction book, which my writing partner, Teresa Halverson, and I wrote. And that'll be again coming out on April 21st. We're actually going to be talking a bit about that one later on in the presentation, so keep it in mind. Now, I'm also the author of The Complex, which actually started this whole presentation or spawned the idea for this presentation. I wrote The Complex, which is a modern day thriller, a paranormal thriller, during 2020, during quarantine, during shutdown. I was seeing so many things and I was so inspired by everything that was happening around me and happening to all of us that a story began to emerge. And I picked and chose little bits of things that were happening in my world and in our greater world, and I threw them into this book. Now, I had a good long talk with my editor before I released this book, which was actually scheduled to release this week. Tiny Dreadfuls ended up taking its place, but The Complex was a little too real life for the moment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through it over the next few months and then bring it back up to the forefront in spring of 2020. But this book got me thinking, how far into real life can we go? How true to real life can we be? So that's what inspired the research for this presentation. All right, so what do I mean by real life? How do we define that? Real life is anything that happens in our reality. So whether it's something that's happened in the past, in your current context, that's real life. So some examples of real life are figures, presidents, politicians, anyone who has truly existed in our world or galaxy. Real events. So something like a significant horse race or the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco or the 1989 World Series. Those are all examples of events that have happened in real life. You could look at something on the news, some scandal, some controversy. True crime is a great example of things to base a story off of or to inspire elements of your story. So that's something that's really a great example of something we see quite common in fiction, which are things based on true crime or real life. Things that happen to you and within your circle of friends or family members. That thing that grocer did while you were buying meat. That story your friend told you about on her trip to Las Vegas. And nothing's supposed to leave Las Vegas, but when you tell writers, it's on your own if that's going to come out or not. But so these are just examples of real life and things that we can look to as inspiration as authors. Some examples of really great books that were based on real life. Some examples of things in history or that have happened out of history. White Houses by Amy Bloom is based on the story of Lorena Hickox having an affair with Eleanor Roosevelt. Apparently there were a bunch of love letters that emerged posthumously and were shared, and this author, Amy Bloom, was so inspired, she wrote a book based on that. Salvage the Bones by Jesmyn Ward was based on Ward's experiences during Hurricane Katrina. So she had to share the story because Like me with the complex, it was a way for her to process what had happened. Things that have happened in the news. My Sister, My Love, The Intimate Story of Schuyler Grandpike by Joyce Carol Oates is actually based on the JonBenet Ramsey case, which all of us are or quite a few of us are very familiar with here in the United States. So that's another really great example of something that's happened in the news that inspired a fiction story. Perfect Nanny was based on a case in 2012 in New York City where a nanny murdered two children. On the news everywhere. It was an extraordinary story. And Leila Slimani was so inspired by it that she took elements of that story and put it into her fiction work. But I believe she has it taking place in France. And that's another really great example of picking and choosing elements out of real life to put in a fiction piece. And of course, the wonderful Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie, which was inspired by the Charles Lindbergh kidnapping case when Charles Lindbergh Jr. was kidnapped and then unfortunately murdered. That inspired Agatha Christie to write Murder on the Orient Express. Looking at examples of you and your circle of books that have been inspired. Women Talking by Miriam Toews is about her experiences being in a Mennonite society and her leaving it and seeing everything that was happening. It was one of those stories that she just had to share with the world to expose what was happening in those circles. And then Miss Burma by Charmaine Craig, which is based on Craig's family's situation in Burma during a very tumultuous time. So there's all sorts of examples of books that are based on real life. Just a quick Google search will give you fantastic lists on some really wonderful reads, which I highly recommend you check out to see how other authors have done it if it's something you're considering doing. So one of the best things that you can do before you even start to write the book is trying to sit down and think to yourself, who am I writing for? Is this book for me? Is this how I'm going to write to heal, to escape? Is this book for my family? Am I writing a memoir about the things that have happened in my world that I want my family to know about? Or is this for market where you're trying to make a few bucks off of it, which is all good, but you want to share the story with the world? So that's something that really helps to define where your audience is going to be and who they are and how far you can go with basing things on real life. Knowing your audience and genre. If you take nothing else away from this presentation, this is key. Know thy genre, know thy readers. And knowing your genre will help you to know how far you should go into details and setting parameters for yourself as well. So a good example is if you're writing an action book where you've got the latest, greatest James Bond piece in mind, and you have your character pick up a gun and that gun responds in a certain way. If you're going to talk about that weapon, make sure if you decide to use its make and model or what have you, if you're going to go that far into the details, be sure you do the research all about that weapon and how it acts, how it reacts, what it looks like, how much it weighs. So because your readers will likely have a pretty good idea of what that weapon is like in real life. So knowing your genre, knowing your boundaries, knowing your readers and their expectations of how far you should go into the details, it's a really good way to set a premise for what research you have to do and then what details to include on the page. And that goes across the board for every genre. So when you're preparing to do your book on real life, definitely do as much research as you can into the subject at hand. So let's say you've just seen this incredible true crime story from the 1970s and you want to write about it. It's inspired you in so many different ways. And you're going to set the book in that time period and have characters look, dress, and feel like they did in the 70s. Good thing to do is to read everything you can about the culture of the 70s and that era and that place where you're writing so it feels authentic, so it feels real, so that when people who lived through that era read your book, they're not going to question it, or they'll have less reason to question it because it'll feel so real because it was their real life experience. So that's something to really dive into the research. Of course, there's always the trap of getting stuck in the research, as we all do. We all have gotten stuck in Google searches or YouTube, the YouTube black hole or the Pinterest black hole. But definitely get a good, firm understanding of what it was like in that place you're writing about, how the people spoke, what they wore, to really give a true feel that this is a real piece. So another good thing to do is have genre-specific beta readers. I say this all the time. Having someone familiar with your genre reading your story goes back to that previous slide, which is all about setting the expectation and knowing the expectation of your readers. I write fantasy, so I'm going to want fantasy beta readers to make sure that I'm within the realm of expectation and building my world correctly. For the complex, which is a totally different story, I'm going to go to people who are familiar with paranormal thrillers so that I can get another really good in-depth analysis of my story to make sure it's meeting all the proper expectations. When we're basing things off of real life, I highly suggest looking into authenticity readers. And what that means is if you're looking to write a story in Northern Appalachia, you want to make sure that you find some beta readers who have been around them parts because you want them to be able to verify, is this how they speak? Is this something that would actually interest someone from Northern Appalachia? You want to have somebody who can kind of verify for you that you're getting those details out correctly, because the last thing we want to do when basing something off of real life is to really offend people, which is something that we're kind of crossing or dipping our toe into, or a problem we can run across when writing about real life. Sensitivity readers is another really important thing if you're doing real life stories. And a great example is if you're writing true crime or something that's based off of a true crime case. If the case is currently active or if it's been in the news in recent years, family members who are related to the individuals involved in the cases are probably still out there and are very much aware of these sort of things that are happening if people are writing about their family. So that's where sensitivity readers may come in handy, or it's one example of a way sensitivity readers may come in handy to help you decide if you're getting a little bit too close to home with some of these details, or if you're in an okay zone where what you're putting out there is different enough from the actual thing that happened. And we're going to get into that in just a second. So as you're putting your piece together, great piece of advice is to show, don't tell. Now you're probably like, this is a bit of a basic tool for all of us authors, something that we all should do anyway. But I can't tell you how many books I have read that are based on real life that were basically just cut and pasted, copied and pasted onto the page from the news articles. This is something we've all kind of done where we just kind of get lost in the details and just move right along. But when you're writing about real life, it's important to not just grab something from someone else's work for a lot of reasons and put it onto your storybook's pages. You want to captivate your readers. You want to hook them right off the bat from the perspective of your characters. And you want us to be entertained so we keep reading and want to read more. Keep your pacing good. Keep your descriptions in line with their genre's expectations. Again, know thy genre, know your readers. To show and don't tell, some of the ways you can do that when turning real life stories into fiction is writing your fiction piece. Use all the feels, as I like to say. Take us into the moment with your main characters or with your characters. What sensory experiences are they going through in your scene? What are they tasting? What touching sensations are they going through? What are they smelling? Are they in pain? How? What level of pain? What does it feel like? Put us in the moment with them. Describe things out. You could say he cried, or you could say tears were running down his face. You could say she laughed hard, or you could say her laughter bent her over and her face ached from smiling for so long. Or, last little example here, and then the bridge fell versus the ground began to shake. The pillars of the bridge began to crumble. When we're taking examples of real life and putting them onto the page, it's very easy to fall into the pit of just repeating the facts. And we don't want to just repeat the facts because the facts will start to weigh us down. If the facts of this true crime case are what inspired you, but this true crimes case's ending fits more in line with the piece you're writing, blend them together. Take bits and pieces of real life to make your story work. Because if you're just taking it all from this story, you're basically just telling us what happened here. So to add a little flair, add a little bit of depth, take and choose from different pieces and pull the descriptions out. Bring this real life story that you're turning into fiction to life. Now, returning to Lost Aboard. This is, again, the story that my writing partner, Teresa Halverson, and I are releasing this week on April 21st. And one of the things that we did was we interviewed a bunch of different people and did a ton of research about the paranormal experiences happening at the Maritime Museum of San Diego's Star of India, which is this beautiful tall ship, which is from 1863. She's very old and she's very haunted. And this was a book that we wanted to bring to life. And we knew we were going to have to fill in the gaps a lot because so many of the stories were passed down orally throughout the years as to how the people became lost aboard and the experiences that several of the staff and volunteers had experienced aboard. So we've called this a creative nonfiction piece, which is on the border of being a novel. So we kind of call it something in between. But one of the things that we experienced a lot were very simple explanations as to what people were experiencing aboard during their paranormal phenomenon. One beautiful example of this was when one of the people we interviewed told us about how she was waiting bar on Star of India one evening, and then she just goes, "It was just a feeling." And so Teresa and I looked at each other and our author brains fired up into life to figure out how to turn her true life story, her real life story, into a piece of creative nonfiction fiction. So what we did was this. We turned "It was just a feeling" into reflected in the glass of her phone, peering over her shoulder were a pair of eyes. Demi whipped around. No one. Heart pounding, she looked at the porthole on the opposite side of the cabin. There was no way anyone could be there. The ramp to board the ship was way above the line of sight, but someone was watching her. She saw it. Trying to shake off the feeling, she searched the tiny room, even opening the large cabinet just in case someone was hiding within. A guest tapped on the bar, interrupting her search. Demi jumped. "Can I get a gin and tonic, please?" he asked. Demi nodded and obliged, happy for the distraction from the pressure of the eyes on her neck. With over 200 people aboard, the ship was alive with music and laughter, but Demi felt only the presence bearing upon her. It stared and whispered to her, though she couldn't make out the words. It wanted something, something she couldn't give. Sweat broke out beneath her arms and trickled down her temples. So that's just a quick example of taking "It was just a feeling," a real life account of a story, and fleshing it out into something that feels like fiction or into a fictional retelling of a real life story. Now, you've been inspired, you've found the piece, your brain is running 100 miles a minute, you've got the story ready to go. One thing to keep in mind as you start writing is to remember to write responsibly. When we're basing things on real life, we want to be a little bit careful with how we do it. Now, of course, this is going to depend on every project you work on and the dates of what you're basing them off of, who you're basing them off of, and all of those things, which is why it's so good to go back to your sensitivity readers, your authenticity readers, and when in doubt, talk to a creative lawyer. They are out there, they are wonderful, and they are there to help guide us through potential legal pitfalls. So definitely, if you're on the fence about including something or not, try to seek out a lawyer to see if you're in a good legal place to be. Now, how to avoid defamation, which is oral written communication that is a false statement about another that constitutes a tort or a crime. Now, defamation cases in books are very interesting. I highly recommend checking that out if you're interested. I am not a lawyer, so I'm not giving any legal advice in this, but some ways to write responsibly are to avoid using real names. So if you're basing this off of someone in history or in your family or within your circle, change the names of your main characters or of your characters. Avoid defining characteristics. So if this is based on your buddy Jeff that you haven't seen in 10 years, but your buddy Jeff had a scar from here to here, that's kind of a defining characteristic. So you may want to not include that in your story. Of course, it's an incredible character trait, but it's one of those things that makes that character identifiable to someone in real life. So you want to avoid that. Avoid making false statements. So that's hardcore in the definition of defamation, where let's say you do base this off of someone and you say Bob Jones did this thing and Bob Jones is a real person. That's where it gets really interesting, and that's where you really want to consult a creative lawyer to make sure you're in a good place or a good standing with your writing. Same goes with avoid attacking a person's reputation or making highly offensive statements about them. These are things you probably would see more likely in nonfiction, but when we're writing or basing our stories off of real life, these are things we can occasionally dip our toes into. Avoid ripping directly from the headlines. And so by that, I mean, don't just copy and paste the story. That goes back into picking and choosing different pieces from different elements of real life to make your story work, to make it flow, and to write responsibly. If you have a friend or somebody you know, or you want to write that story about that famous person, and it can't be without them being the real star, try to obtain a release. Definitely need a creative lawyer for that, but releases help us to work through and to get the permissions of these people to take their lives and put them on the page. Add disclaimers. Disclaimers are a fantastic way to show your readers and your audience that you are a very serious writer. And of course, your publisher will probably work with you to do this. But if you're publishing yourself, just add a disclaimer in there, because that shows that you're aware of these things being potentially legal pitfalls and that you are being responsible enough to acknowledge it. So with Lost Aboard, this is the disclaimer that we included. This novel is a work of creative nonfiction. Where the authors were unable to authenticate certain details, the names, characters, and incidents portrayed in it became the work of the author's imagination. We also included another note just to be extra careful, and this is within the actual body of the text. The first was on our copyright page. So for this one, we said, we have taken some liberties in bringing these stories to life, though we've done all we can to be accurate. Most of Star of India's ghost stories are oral traditions written down after the fact, and, we admit, likely embellished. Our goal is to bring the lost soul stories, both how they lived and how they continue to haunt, into the light of day. With the exception of one story and of our author, Sarah, who has personally experienced the paranormal aboard Star of India, in their stories and of those who have been passed on through the years, we have changed the names of those who have shared their experiences. Any errors made are ours and ours alone. So this is what we ended up doing to kind of lay down the foundation of we're acknowledging that we did not get this all from fact. And again, don't let fact restrain your fiction piece. But with this book in particular, which is so based on real life, we wanted to make sure people were very aware that we threw a lot of our fiction, a lot of our storytelling into this book. And before we kind of dive into your rights, I just want to talk 1 second about some examples of getting releases that are really funny. In the show Arrested Development, which I know is a little dated, in the last season, Michael's running around trying to get the permissions from all of his family members to do a show of his family. And he goes around to every single one of them and has to go all through these different hoops to get the rights and the releases from them. And then, of course, ends up tearing them anyway. Spoiler. But it's just an example, an extreme example of what getting the rights from people looks like. It's usually a piece of paper, simple signature, but you want to, again, make sure you have a lawyer on hand to help you through with all of that. Now, conversely, something that might happen if you don't do this properly. There's a really great movie that's on HBO Max right now. It's called Let Them All Talk, and it stars Meryl Streep. It's a phenomenal movie. I highly recommend it to see what may happen if you don't go through those steps of making sure you're disconnecting your story enough from real life when basing the stories on people who are around you. So it's a really good, really fun movie. I highly recommend. All right, returning to this, your rights. It's okay to write about real life. I cannot emphasize that enough. It's a phenomenal way to get inspiration. It's a wonderful way if you're stuck or you're in that dreaded writer's block to find stories, because no piece is original, of course, and real life has so many extraordinary things happening. And there's that great line of reality is far stranger than fiction. And it's so true. So don't be intimidated by all of this when making your story based on real life. You are, of course, as an American citizen, for our friends who are watching this in the US, you have your First Amendment right to protect you. And don't feel afraid about capturing something that has happened and expressing it in your own words. We are writers, we are storytellers, and if we choose from real life, or if we find inspiration from real life, that is a beautiful way for us to express and for us to process anything that is happening. And that's it for my presentation. See if I can actually tune in to see if we have any questions. Let's see. Checking my board here to see if we have any questions. Let's see. First of all, thank you all so much for joining me here today. This has been absolutely wonderful. I've really enjoyed putting this presentation together. I know it's kind of cutting off early. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to message me. I'll be happy to answer those. And if nobody has any questions, that's fine. Very, very, very grateful to Flights of Foundry for giving me this opportunity to give this presentation. Again, my name is Sarah Faxon. I'm author, creative warrior, and my books can be found, and my creative pieces may be found at www.sfaxon.com. I see I have a question on Discord. Thank you for those who are watching me staring blankly at my screen. I am checking that now. I'm fascinated by how we've been able to adapt to COVID-19, and it's just very interesting to participate in these conferences remotely and to have questions coming in from different angles. Trying to. Okay, so the question from Discord is, how do you decide if something is sensitive or not? Like with my pandemic book, The Complex. Well, I ran it by my editor and a couple of beta readers, and we decided that it was still a little too soon for this to happen. I have every intention of releasing my book, which does take place during a pandemic. It feels a lot like what we've just been through, but I never once say in the story COVID-19 or make any direct references to this pandemic. But I do talk about the school shutting down. And I think that was one of the big things that my beta reader said was a little too much right now, because at the time when I was putting this out, it was still so uncertain as to when anything was going to open up again. So that was one example of something that was deemed to be a little too sensitive for right now, which I totally understand and I respect. And I definitely take my beta readers' critiques to heart, and I definitely think long and hard on them. And that was one of the decisions that we did make. Let's see if we get any other questions coming here. Oh, this is a great question. So the question is, although one cannot libel the dead, which is very true, so you can write about the dead, is it possible for living relatives, descendants, friends of the deceased to prohibit possible publication? I'm going to say that's a definitely check with a creative lawyer one, because it's a no, but with conditions. There's some people who have rights that their families own. So you want to be really careful if you're writing about someone who was extremely famous, for example. Just double check with a creative lawyer when in doubt. That's the best thing to do. Creative lawyers can be found on LegalZoom. And check around in your networks and check around on different social media platforms to get recommendations from other authors about good creative lawyers that they would recommend. And especially if you're doing traditional publishing, that's something you can discuss with your publisher. But if you're a self-publication, apparently I'm still sharing my screen. Sorry about that. I think I stopped sharing my screen. So if you're doing self-publication, that's something you want to be really conscientious of, and it doesn't hurt to consult a creative lawyer when in doubt. I just want to thank my friend Molly for funneling these questions to me. I really appreciate that, Molly. Do you have any other questions? And thank you all so much for attending. I really appreciate it. This is absolutely wonderful and fantastic topic, and something I really encourage you all to do your own research on and to explore and try to find a real life story that inspires you. If you're not sure where to start writing, check the news from the early 1920s. That was a really interesting time, or the late 1800s into the 1920s. There's so much happening in the news back then, and it was also creatively written. It's just a really good place to start and to inspire you. Well, I'm hearing that everyone is saying thank you, and I also want to say thank you guys again so much for being here today. I really appreciate it. I had a blast putting this together. And again, feel free to drop me a line over at sfaxon.com. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have following this presentation. And again, guys, never stop writing, and cheers, cheers.